Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
Walking into my parents' house, that Thanksgiving evening, I never expected the annual family dinner would become the night everything changed. My father Harold stood at the head of the dining room table, wine glass raised, staring directly at me with that familiar look of disappointment. "Peter," he announced loudly enough for all 23 family members to hear, "when are you going to stop throwing money away on rent and actually achieve something? Look at your sister Rachel with her beautiful lakeside mansion, your 28 years old son. Will you spend your whole life renting?" The entire room erupted in laughter as my cheeks burned with embarrassment, but I remained silent, knowing something they didn't. Growing up as Harold and Susan's younger child meant living in Rachel's shadow from the moment I could walk. She was everything our parents wanted in a daughter: straight A student, homecoming queen, full scholarship to Stanford, and later, a seemingly successful career in marketing that afforded her the kind of lifestyle our middle-class family could only dream about. I remember being 12 years old, standing in our cramped kitchen, while Harold showed off Rachel's latest report card to anyone who would listen. 4.0 grade point average again. He'd beam, then glance at my B-plus average with visible frustration. "Peter, why can't you apply yourself like your sister? She's going places in this world." Those words became the soundtrack of my childhood. Every family gathering, every school event, every casual conversation somehow circled back to Rachel's achievements and my apparent shortcomings. When she graduated valedictorian, I was a decent student. When she landed her first job at a prestigious advertising firm, I was still figuring out my direction. When she bought her first condo at 24, I was sharing an apartment with 3 roommates while building my consulting business from scratch. The lakeside mansion became Harold's favorite topic 3 years ago, when Rachel and her husband Brad surprised the family with photos during Christmas dinner. 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, wraparound deck overlooking Lake George in upstate New York, worth over $800,000 according to Rachel's breathless description. Now this is what success looks like, Harold had declared, passing around his phone with pictures of granite countertops and vaulted ceilings. "Peter, are you even saving for a down payment? You can't rent forever, son." What Harold didn't know was that I'd been quietly building something real. My technology consulting firm specialized in helping small businesses streamline their operations through custom software solutions. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and more importantly, it was growing. I'd reinvested every penny back into the business, choosing to live modestly in a 1-bedroom apartment in Hartford rather than chase the superficial markers of success that seemed to matter so much to my family. The extended family had gathered as usual for Thanksgiving. Harold's brother Martin, with his wife Diane, and their twin sons, Susan's sister Carol, and her daughter Jessica, plus an assortment of cousins and family friends who'd become fixtures at our holiday celebrations. The dining room buzzed with the familiar mixture of football commentary, political arguments, and catching up on whose kids were excelling at what. Rachel held court at the center of attention, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the chandelier light as she regaled everyone with stories of their recent trip to Tuscany. Brad sat beside her in an expensive suit, nodding along while scrolling through his phone, occasionally looking up to add details about wine tastings and 5-star restaurants. The villa we rented had its own vineyard. Rachel was saying her diamond tennis bracelet, catching the light as she gestured. Brad surprised me with a private cooking class with this incredible chef who'd worked at Michelin-starred restaurants in Florence. "How wonderful," Aunt Carol gushed. "You two live such exciting lives. Peter, when was the last time you traveled anywhere interesting?" I was about to respond when Harold jumped in. "Peter's too busy counting pennies to afford real vacations. Still living in that tiny apartment, throwing money away on rent every month instead of building equity." The conversation that followed was achingly familiar. Cousin Martin chimed in about the importance of home ownership. Jessica mentioned how her boyfriend had just bought a townhouse. Even Brad, who rarely spoke to me directly, made a comment about real estate being the foundation of wealth building. What none of them knew was what I'd discovered 3 weeks earlier when I'd stopped by the coffee shop near my office and spotted Rachel's real estate agent Nancy Williams at a corner table, looking visibly distressed while talking on her phone. I'd worked with Nancy 2 years ago when I'd briefly considered buying a condo, so I recognized her immediately. "I understand your situation is difficult," Nancy had been saying in a voice barely above a whisper. "But the foreclosure process has already begun. If you can't bring the account current within 60 days, we'll have to proceed with the sale." The blood had drained from my face as I realized she was talking about Rachel's dream house. I'd positioned myself where I could hear without being seen, my heart racing as the full conversation unfolded. "Mrs. Williams, please," came Rachel's desperate voice through the phone speaker. "There has to be another option. We just need more time. Brad's expecting a big commission check, and I'm waiting on several client payments. Surely the bank can work with us." "I'm afraid we've already extended the timeline twice," Nancy had replied with professional sympathy. "The property is currently 4 months behind on payments, and the total amount needed to cure the default is now over $37,000. Without that payment, the foreclosure will proceed as scheduled." I'd sat frozen in my chair, coffee growing cold in my hands, as the conversation continued. Rachel had tried to negotiate payment plans, partial payments, anything to buy more time, but Nancy's responses made it clear the situation was beyond repair. The mansion that had become Harold's symbol of Rachel's success was about to be taken away. But that wasn't even the worst part. Now sitting at the dinner table while Harold continued his annual tradition of comparing my life to Rachel's, I could see the strain in her face that nobody else seemed to notice. Her smile was too bright, her laugh too quick, her constant fidgeting with her wedding ring betraying nerves that expensive wine couldn't calm. "Peter's problem," Harold was saying to Uncle Martin, "is that he's too comfortable being mediocre. Rachel understood early that you have to take risks to build real wealth. Look at that beautiful home they've created." I caught Rachel's eye across the table, and for just a moment, her perfect facade cracked. The fear I saw there made me feel something I'd never expected. Not satisfaction at her downfall, but genuine sadness for what she was facing. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was Harold using Rachel's supposed success to humiliate me, while Rachel sat terrified that her world was about to collapse. And I was the only person in the room who knew the truth. As the conversation moved on to other topics, I found myself studying the family dynamics I'd accepted my entire life. Harold dominated every discussion, dismissing Susan's attempts to redirect conversations away from money and status. Aunt Carol hung on every word about Rachel's lifestyle, clearly using it as ammunition for her own family comparisons. The younger cousins absorbed it all, learning that worth was measured in square footage and designer labels rather than character or kindness. Rachel excused herself to use the bathroom, and I watched Brad barely look up from his phone. Their marriage had always seemed picture perfect from the outside. Two beautiful, successful people living an enviable life. But now, I was starting to notice cracks I'd missed before. When Rachel returned, her makeup was freshly applied, but her hands were still shaking slightly as she reached for her wine glass. She launched back into stories about their renovation plans for the spring, describing elaborate landscaping projects and a potential pool installation with the kind of enthusiastic detail that sounded almost manic. Harold ate it up, of course, using each new detail as another opportunity to contrast Rachel's ambitious planning with my apparent lack of vision. "Peter, you're missing out on so much by renting," he said, cutting into his turkey with unnecessary force. "Equity tax advantages the satisfaction of building something permanent. When are you going to grow up and make a real investment in your future?" I set down my fork carefully, meeting his eyes across the table. "Actually, Dad, I've been thinking a lot about real estate lately." The entire table quieted, sensing something different in my tone. Rachel's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. "Oh." Harold raised an eyebrow, probably expecting me to announce some modest condo purchase that he could find ways to criticize. Yes, I said quietly. I've been learning quite a bit about the real estate market recently, particularly about what happens when people overextend themselves financially. Rachel's face went completely white. The discovery of Rachel's foreclosure had been shocking enough, but what I learned in the weeks that followed shattered any remaining illusions about my perfect sister. The real horror began when I decided to help our grandmother Dorothy organize her financial paperwork. At 92, Grandma Dorothy lived in a charming assisted living facility about 20 minutes from my apartment. She'd been my champion throughout childhood, the one family member who never compared me to Rachel, who celebrated my small victories and encouraged my interest in technology when Harold dismissed them as impractical. Dorothy had mild dementia that came and went in waves. Some days she was sharp as ever, regaling me with stories from her youth or offering surprisingly astute observations about current events. Other days, she struggled to remember names or became confused about where she was. I'd been visiting her twice a week since moving back to Connecticut, helping with everything from organizing her medications to dealing with insurance paperwork. It was during one of these visits 2 weeks after overhearing Nancy's phone call that I discovered something that made my stomach turn. "Peter, dear," Dorothy had said, shuffling through a stack of bank statements with trembling fingers, "I'm so confused about these numbers." Rachel explained it all to me, but I can't seem to remember what she said. I'd offered to help, expecting to find the usual complications elderly people face with online banking and automated deposits. Instead, I found a systematic pattern of withdrawals that made no sense. Dorothy's monthly expenses were modest and predictable: the assisted living facility, supplemental insurance medications, and small amounts for personal needs. Her income from Social Security and her late husband's pension more than covered these costs, with a healthy margin left over. She should have been accumulating savings, not depleting them. But her account balance had dropped from nearly $87,000 8 months ago to just under $31,000. Withdrawals of $3,000 here, $5,000 there, always accompanied by deposit slips showing cash transactions that Dorothy clearly hadn't made herself. "Grandma," I'd asked carefully, trying not to alarm her, "do you remember asking Rachel to help you with banking?" Dorothy's eyes had brightened momentarily. "Oh yes, she's such a good girl. She said I didn't need to worry about money anymore, that she'd take care of everything. She has that power of attorney paper, very official looking." My heart had started racing. "When did you sign that paper?" "Oh, sometime last year, I think. Maybe winter." Rachel said it would make everything easier, that I wouldn't have to worry about bills and such. She's so much smarter about money than I am. The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Rachel had convinced our vulnerable grandmother to sign over power of attorney, then systematically drained her savings account to fund the lifestyle that was crumbling around her. I'd spent the next 3 days collecting documentation. The power of attorney document, which I found in Dorothy's file cabinet, was legitimate but broad in scope, giving Rachel complete control over Dorothy's finances. The bank statements showed a clear pattern starting about 7 months ago: regular large withdrawals that corresponded almost exactly with Rachel's mortgage payment schedule. When I cross-referenced the dates with Rachel's social media posts, the correlation was sickening. The weekend Rachel posted photos from their surprise getaway to Martha's Vineyard coincided with a $4,000 withdrawal from Dorothy's account. The designer handbag she'd shown off at Harold's birthday dinner was purchased the day after a $3,000 cash transaction. But the most damaging evidence came when I found copies of forged withdrawal slips in Dorothy's wastebasket. Slips that bore Dorothy's signature, but were clearly written in Rachel's handwriting. Rachel had been practicing Dorothy's signature, getting sloppy because she thought no one was paying attention. I'd consulted with my girlfriend Sarah, who worked as a social worker specializing in elder abuse cases. Her reaction had been immediate and unequivocal. "Peter, this is textbook financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult," she'd said, reviewing the documents I'd carefully copied. The power of attorney gives Rachel legal authority to manage your grandmother's finances, but she's clearly using it for personal benefit rather than your grandmother's welfare. This is a serious crime. Sarah had explained the legal ramifications: felony charges for elder abuse, potential restitution requirements, and the likelihood that Rachel would face jail time if prosecuted. She'd also helped me understand the psychological profile of financial abusers, how they often rationalized their behavior as temporary borrowing, or justified it by claiming the victim wouldn't miss the money. The really insidious thing, Sarah had told me, is that victims with cognitive impairment often can't advocate for themselves. Your grandmother trusts Rachel completely, which makes the betrayal even more devastating. I'd started visiting Dorothy more frequently, partly to monitor the situation, and partly because I felt guilty for not catching the abuse sooner. During one of these visits, Dorothy had shown me a credit card statement that nearly made me sick. "I'm so confused about this, Peter. I was," she'd said, holding up a Visa statement with a balance of over $12,000. "Rachel said I needed this for emergencies, but I don't remember using it for anything." The charges were all Rachel's: high-end restaurants, clothing stores, spa treatments, and cash advances. Rachel had opened a credit card in Dorothy's name and was using it like her personal expense account. "Grandma, did Rachel ask you to sign anything else recently?" "Oh, she brings me papers sometimes. She's so patient explaining everything, but honestly, dear, I don't understand half of what she talks about. She says it's all to help me, so I just sign where she tells me to." The scope of Rachel's betrayal was staggering. She hadn't just taken advantage of Dorothy's trust. She'd systematically exploited her grandmother's love and cognitive vulnerability to fund her failing lifestyle. Every family gathering where Rachel had been praised for her success, every time Harold had used her as an example of what I should aspire to, she'd been living off money stolen from our elderly grandmother. I'd spent sleepless nights wrestling with what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront Rachel directly, to give her a chance to make things right before involving authorities. But Sarah had warned me that confrontation often led abusers to accelerate their theft or intimidate victims into silence. You need to think about your grandmother's safety first, Sarah had advised. If Rachel realizes she's been caught, she might pressure Dorothy to cover for her or even move money out of accounts before you can stop her. So I'd quietly documented everything: bank statements, credit card bills, copies of the forged signatures, photos of the power of attorney paperwork. I'd also started monitoring Dorothy's accounts online, watching for new withdrawals that would signal Rachel was escalating her theft. The hardest part was maintaining normal family relationships while knowing what Rachel was doing. At Harold's birthday dinner 3 weeks ago, I'd had to sit silently while Rachel presented him with an expensive watch, knowing she'd bought it with Dorothy's money. When she talked about their upcoming kitchen renovation, describing granite countertops and custom cabinets, I'd felt physically sick knowing every dollar was stolen. But what really haunted me was Dorothy's gratitude toward Rachel. "She's such a blessing," Dorothy would tell me during our visits. "I don't know what I'd do without her help. She's always been such a responsible girl." Now, sitting at the Thanksgiving table, while Harold continued his annual tradition of humiliating me, through comparison to Rachel, I carried the weight of knowing exactly what my responsible sister had become. Every word of praise for her financial acumen was like a knife twisting in my chest, not because of the comparison, but because of what she'd done to earn the money Harold was so busy admiring. Rachel's phone buzzed on the table beside her plate. She glanced at it and her face went even whiter, if that was possible. She quickly turned the phone face down, but not before I caught a glimpse of the screen. It was a text message from someone named Legal Aid Society. The walls were closing in on her from multiple directions, and she had no idea that I knew about any of it. Part of me felt a twisted satisfaction at her obvious distress, but mostly, I felt a deep sadness for how far she'd fallen and how much damage she was about to cause to everyone who loved her. Harold was still talking, oblivious to the drama unfolding right in front of him. "The thing about Peter," he was saying to Uncle Martin, "is that he's too conservative. Rachel understood that sometimes you have to spend money to make money. Look how that philosophy paid off for her." I caught Rachel's eye again, and this time she held my gaze. There was something pleading in her expression, as if she sensed that I knew more than I was letting on. Her hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. "You know what, Dad?" I said quietly, my voice cutting through the dinner conversation. "You're absolutely right about Rachel's approach to money. She's definitely spent quite a bit to maintain her lifestyle." The table fell silent, sensing something different in my tone. Rachel's face had gone from white to gray. "She certainly has," Harold agreed, missing the undercurrent completely. "And look at the results. That beautiful home, the successful marriage, the financial security. Peter, you could learn a lot from your sister's example?" I nodded slowly, never taking my eyes off Rachel. "Oh, I've learned quite a bit from Rachel's example, particularly about where the money's been coming from. The restaurant was an upscale steakhouse in downtown Hartford, where I'd taken a potential client for dinner the previous Tuesday. I'd been discussing cloud-based inventory systems over appetizers when I spotted a familiar figure at a corner booth across the dining room. Brad was leaning intimately across the table toward a brunette woman I'd never seen before, his hand covering hers while she laughed at something he'd whispered. At first, I'd tried to convince myself it was a business dinner. Brad worked in pharmaceutical sales, and he'd mentioned having female colleagues before. But as I watched their interaction throughout my own meal, it became impossible to ignore the obvious chemistry between them. The way he touched her arm when making a point, how she leaned into him, when he spoke, the lingering kiss they shared, when she excused herself to use the restroom. These were not the behaviors of professional colleagues. I discreetly paid my bill and positioned myself near the restaurant's entrance where I could observe without being seen. When they finally left together, Brad's hand resting possessively on the small of her back, I felt sick to my stomach. Whatever else Rachel had done, she didn't deserve this kind of betrayal from her husband. My investigative instincts, honed by years of solving complex business problems, kicked into gear. Over the next week, I'd done some careful research into Brad's recent activities. His social media presence had become notably sparse over the past few months, with fewer photos of him and Rachel together and more solo shots from business trips and networking events. The breakthrough came when I'd run into Jennifer Martinez, Rachel's college roommate and current best friend, at the grocery store near my apartment. Jennifer worked as a nurse at Hartford Hospital, and she'd always been friendly toward me, despite the family dynamics that usually left me on the outside of Rachel's social circle. "Peter," she'd called out cheerfully, pushing her cart toward me in the produce section. "I haven't seen you in forever. How are you doing?" We'd chatted casually about work and family before Jennifer's expression grew more serious. "I have to say I'm a little worried about Rachel lately. She seems really stressed about something, but she won't talk about it. You know how she gets when she's trying to handle everything herself." I'd nodded sympathetically, fishing for more information without revealing what I already knew. "Is everything okay with her and Brad?" Jennifer had hesitated, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but she's been having these panic attacks. Started about 3 months ago. She tries to hide it, but I've seen her having trouble breathing during our lunch dates. And she's been asking strange questions about divorce law and asset protection." My heart had started racing. Divorce law? She claimed it was for a friend, but Rachel's never been good at lying to me. She wanted to know about things like hidden assets and offshore accounts, what happens to debt in a divorce, that sort of thing. I told her to talk to a lawyer if it was serious, but she got all defensive and changed the subject. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Brad wasn't just having an affair, he was planning his exit strategy. The timing made perfect sense. If he was smart about it, he could file for divorce right after the holidays, claiming irreconcilable differences while Rachel was dealing with the foreclosure. He'd walk away clean while she faced the financial and legal consequences alone. Has she mentioned any problems with money? I'd asked carefully. Jennifer had looked around again before leaning closer. Actually, yes. Last week, she asked me if I could lend her $5,000 for what she called a temporary cash flow issue. I don't have that kind of money just lying around, but the way she asked, Freddie was almost desperate, like she was running out of options. I'd thanked Jennifer for the conversation and spent the rest of the week quietly investigating Brad's financial activities. It wasn't hard to find evidence once I knew what to look for. His LinkedIn profile showed connections to several offshore banking specialists and asset protection attorneys. His recent business trips, which Rachel had mentioned proudly during family dinners, were to locations known for their banking privacy laws: the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg. A casual conversation with a mutual acquaintance who worked in Brad's industry had confirmed my suspicions. Brad's been really focused on international opportunities lately, the colleague had told me over coffee. Something about diversifying his portfolio and taking advantage of global market opportunities. He's been working with some high-end financial advisors who specialize in international wealth management. The pattern was clear. While Rachel had been stealing from Dorothy to keep their lifestyle afloat, Brad had been systematically moving their legitimate assets out of reach. He'd probably been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment to leave Rachel holding the bag for all their debts while he started fresh with his hidden money and his girlfriend. The cruelest irony was that Rachel had no idea what was coming. She was so focused on maintaining their perfect image and hiding their financial problems that she hadn't noticed her husband preparing to abandon her completely. Now, sitting at the Thanksgiving table while Harold continued praising Rachel's marriage as another example of her superior life choices, I felt like I was watching a Greek tragedy unfold in real time. Rachel was desperately trying to maintain her facade while terror ate away at her composure. Brad sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, probably texting his girlfriend, while his wife faced the collapse of everything she'd built. The conversation had moved on to other topics, but I could see Rachel's growing agitation. She kept checking her phone, her leg bouncing nervously under the table. Every few minutes, she'd force herself to join the conversation with an overly bright comment or laugh, but her heart clearly wasn't in it. Harold was telling Uncle Martin about his retirement plans, how he and Susan were considering downsizing now that both kids were settled and successful. We've been thinking about taking some of our equity and investing in Rachel's next real estate venture, he was saying proudly. She's got such a good eye for properties, and the returns on real estate have been incredible lately. My blood ran cold. Harold was planning to give Rachel money. Money she would inevitably lose to foreclosure or use to pay down the debt from her theft. Money my parents couldn't afford to lose. I glanced at Susan, who was listening to Harold's announcement with obvious concern. She'd always been the more practical parent, the one who worried about having enough saved for emergencies and retirement. The idea of investing their nest egg in anything risky clearly made her uncomfortable. "Harold, dear," Susan said gently, "shouldn't we be more conservative with our retirement funds? We've worked so hard to build up our savings." "Now, Susan, you worry too much?" Harold dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Rachel's proven herself in real estate. This is a chance to help our daughter while securing our own financial future. It's a win-win situation." Rachel had gone completely still, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. She was staring at Harold with an expression that might have been gratitude if it weren't for the pure terror in her eyes. Brad's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with a smile that had nothing to do with family dinner. "Excuse me," he said, standing up from the table. "I need to take this call. Business opportunity that can't wait." As Brad walked toward the kitchen for privacy, I caught a glimpse of his phone screen. The contact name read Amanda, with a heart emoji. His affair was right there in front of everyone, but only I seemed to notice. Rachel watched her husband leave the room, and I saw something break behind her eyes. Maybe she didn't know the full extent of Brad's betrayal, but she clearly suspected something. The way her shoulders sagged, the tremor in her hands as she set down her fork, she looked like someone who was drowning. and had just realized there was no one coming to save her. The worst part was watching Harold continue to praise a marriage that was already over, and a financial success that had never really existed. Every word of admiration was another weight dragging Rachel down another lie she had to maintain, while her world crumbled around her. I found myself feeling genuinely sorry for her despite everything she'd done. Yes, she'd stolen from our grandmother and built her life on deception, but she was also about to lose everything, while the man she'd trusted most prepared to abandon her to face the consequences alone. The sound of Brad's laughter drifted in from the kitchen, intimate and warm in a way I'd never heard him talk to Rachel. Meanwhile, my sister sat at our family table surrounded by people who loved and admired her completely alone, with the knowledge that her perfect life was about to collapse. Harold was still talking about real estate investments, completely oblivious to the fact that he was describing his plan to throw money into a bottomless pit. And I was the only person in the room who knew enough to stop him. As Brad returned to the table with a satisfied smile and Rachel forced herself to ask about his business call, I realized I was facing an impossible choice. Staying silent would allow my parents to lose money they couldn't afford to lose, money that would disappear into Rachel's debt and legal problems, but speaking up would destroy not just Rachel, but potentially the entire family structure that, however flawed, was the only one we had. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. For the first time in my life, I held all the power in our family dynamics, and I had no idea what to do with it. The conversation I overheard between my parents later that evening changed everything. I'd volunteered to help clear the dinner dishes while most of the family moved to the living room to watch football. Partly to be useful, and partly because I needed a moment away from the suffocating tension of watching Rachel's facade crumble in real time. Harold and Susan had retreated to the kitchen for what they thought was a private conversation, while I was in the dining room stacking plates. Their voices carried clearly through the open doorway, and what I heard made my stomach drop to the floor. "I've already spoken to the bank about a home equity line of credit," Harold was saying in the tone he used when he'd made up his mind about something. "With property values what they are now, we can easily access $150,000 without affecting our monthly budget significantly." "Harold, that scares me," Susan replied, and I could hear the worry in her voice. "We're 68 and 66 years old. Taking on that kind of debt at our age seems incredibly risky." "Susan, you're not thinking like an investor," Harold continued with the condescending patience he always used when Susan expressed practical concerns. "Rachel's real estate portfolio has been generating consistent returns for years. She's offering us a chance to participate in her next acquisition, a commercial property in downtown Albany that she's identified as significantly undervalued." I had to grip the edge of the dining room table to keep from dropping the stack of plates in my hands. There was no commercial property in Albany. There was no real estate portfolio generating returns. Harold was describing an investment opportunity that existed only in Rachel's desperate imagination. "But what if something goes wrong?" Susan pressed. "What if the property doesn't appreciate like she expects? What if there are unexpected repairs or the market changes? We'd be responsible for that debt regardless of what happens with the investment." "Nothing's going to go wrong," Harold said with absolute confidence. "Rachel's track record speaks for itself. Look at what she's accomplished with that beautiful lakeside house. She understands real estate markets better than any of those high-priced financial advisors who just want to sell you mutual funds with their hidden fees." The irony was so crushing, I felt physically sick. Harold was using Rachel's foreclosing mansion as evidence of her financial expertise, while planning to bet their retirement security on her next imaginary success. "I just think we should be more conservative," Susan said quietly. "Maybe we could invest a smaller amount, something we could afford to lose if things don't work out." Susan, conservative thinking is why we're still living in the same house we bought 35 years ago, while other people our age are enjoying investment properties and comfortable retirements. Harold replied with growing frustration. Rachel's offering us a chance to finally build some real wealth. I'm not going to let fear keep us from securing our financial future. I'd heard enough. Setting the dishes down as quietly as possible, I moved closer to the kitchen doorway where I could see my parents' faces. Harold's expression was animated, with the enthusiasm he always showed when discussing money-making schemes. Susan looked terrified, but resigned the same expression she'd worn my entire childhood whenever Harold made unilateral decisions about their finances. "When are you planning to do this?" Susan asked. "I'm meeting with the bank on Monday morning to finalize the paperwork," Harold said. "Rachel needs an answer by the end of next week so she can move forward with the purchase. Apparently, there are other investors interested, and she doesn't want us to miss this opportunity." The timeline made perfect sense from Rachel's perspective. She was probably hoping to use Harold's money to bring her mortgage current and avoid foreclosure, buying herself time to figure out her next move. She might even be planning to claim the investment had fallen through after using the money to pay her bills. "Harold, please," Susan said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Can't we at least talk to a financial advisor first, someone independent who can look at this objectively? We don't need to pay some stranger to tell us what's obviously a good opportunity," Harold replied dismissively. "Rachel's our daughter Susan. She's not going to steer us wrong." The conversation ended with Harold's announcement that he was going to watch the game, leaving Susan alone in the kitchen with her fears. I waited until Harold had left before entering, finding my mother standing at the sink with tears streaming down her face. "Mom," I said gently, "are you okay?" She quickly wiped her eyes and tried to smile. "Oh, Peter, I didn't hear you come in. I'm fine, just tired from cooking all day." But I could see she wasn't fine at all. Susan had always been the practical parent, the one who clipped coupons and watched the grocery budget, while Harold dreamed of get-rich-quick schemes that never materialized. The idea of mortgaging their home for a risky investment was her worst nightmare. "Mom, I heard Dad talking about investing in Rachel's real estate deal," I said carefully. "How do you feel about that?" Susan's composure cracked completely. "I'm terrified, Peter," she whispered, glancing toward the living room to make sure Harold couldn't hear. "We've worked so hard to pay off the house. It's our security blanket. If something goes wrong with this investment, we could lose everything we've built." "Have you told Dad how you feel?" "You know how your father gets about money," Susan said sadly. "Once he's convinced something is a good idea, there's no changing his mind. And he's so proud of Rachel's success. I can't bring myself to suggest that she might not know what she's doing." The weight of what I knew was crushing. Here was my mother, terrified about risking their financial security on an investment that I knew was essentially a scam, while my father prepared to bet their future on a daughter who was stealing from his own mother to pay her bills. "Mom, what if I told you that Rachel's financial situation might not be what it appears to be?" Susan looked at me sharply. "What do you mean?" Before I could answer, Rachel appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale, but her smile bright. "Mrs. Coleman, can I help you with anything?" she asked, using the formal address she'd adopted after marrying Brad. "Oh no, dear Peter and I were just finishing up," Susan replied quickly, but I could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. Rachel's gaze shifted between Susan and me, and I could see her calculating whether we'd been discussing something she needed to worry about. Her paranoia was understandable given what she was hiding, but it also made her dangerous. A cornered animal was always unpredictable. "Peter, I haven't had a chance to talk to you much today," Rachel said with forced casualness. "How's your consulting business going, still working with small companies?" There was something probing in her tone, as if she was testing to see how much I knew about business and finance. Maybe she was wondering if I was smart enough to see through her schemes. "It's going well," I replied carefully. "Actually, I've learned quite a bit about financial management working with struggling businesses. You'd be amazed how many companies look successful on the surface while they're actually drowning in debt." Rachel's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind her eyes. How interesting. I'm sure that's good experience for you. It is. I continued holding her gaze. I've gotten pretty good at spotting the warning signs. Irregular cash flows, desperate attempts to bring in new investors using credit to maintain appearances while the fundamentals are failing. It's actually pretty common in real estate development. The color drained from Rachel's face, but she managed to keep smiling. Well, I should get back to Brad. He's probably wondering where I disappeared to. As Rachel left the kitchen, Susan looked at me with confusion. What was that about, Peter? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I said next would change everything. Mom, I need to tell you something about Rachel's real estate investments. And I need you to promise me that you won't let Dad mortgage the house until we've had a chance to talk about this properly. The fear in Susan's eyes deepened, but she nodded. What is it? Before I could answer, Harold's voice boomed from the living room. Susan, Peter, come watch this replay. You've got to see this incredible touchdown pass. The moment was lost, but as we walked toward the living room together, Susan grabbed my arm. Promise me we'll talk more about this, she whispered urgently. I promise, I replied, knowing that conversation would probably save their financial future. In the living room, the extended family was gathered around Harold's large screen television, cheering and arguing about football plays with the passion that only comes after a big meal and several glasses of wine. Rachel sat next to Brad on the couch, but I noticed they weren't touching. Brad was absorbed in his phone again while Rachel stared at the television without really seeing it. Harold was in his element, holding court about football strategy, while dispensing drinks and keeping the conversation lively. This was Harold at his best. Generous, entertaining, surrounded by family and friends who genuinely enjoyed his company. It made what I was about to do even harder, because I knew now that I couldn't stay silent. Harold's plan to invest their retirement savings in Rachel's non-existent real estate deal wasn't just misguided. It was financial suicide. If I didn't speak up, my parents would lose their home. Rachel would still face foreclosure and criminal charges, and Dorothy would never get her stolen money back. But speaking up meant destroying the family dynamic that, however flawed, had held us together for decades. It meant watching Harold's pride crumble as he realized his golden child was a criminal. It meant seeing Rachel face the consequences of her choices in the most public, humiliating way possible. As I sat there watching my family laugh and argue about football, unaware that their world was about to change forever, I felt the crushing weight of being the only person who could prevent a disaster that would hurt everyone I loved. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Harold had dismissed my intelligence and practical thinking as mediocrity. Now those same qualities were the only thing standing between our family and financial ruin. When Brad's phone rang and he stepped outside to take another business call with his girlfriend, I saw Rachel's hands start trembling again. She was running out of time and options, and she knew it. The question was whether I would let her drag the rest of us down with her, or whether I would finally find the courage to speak the truth that would save my family, but destroy my sister. The football game played on, but I wasn't watching anymore. I was preparing myself for the hardest conversation of my life. The moment came when Harold stood up during a commercial break, wine glass in hand, and called for everyone's attention. The living room fell quiet as our extended family turned toward him, expecting another of his traditional holiday toasts about gratitude and family success. I want to take a moment to talk about what real success looks like. Harold began, his voice carrying the authority he'd cultivated over decades of being the family patriarch. We're fortunate to have such accomplished children, and I think it's important to acknowledge that publicly. My stomach clenched as I realized where this was heading. Susan shot me a worried glance from across the room, remembering our interrupted conversation in the kitchen. Rachel, would you stand up, please? Harold continued, gesturing toward my sister with obvious pride. I want everyone to hear about the incredible investment opportunity she's offered your mother and me. Rachel's face went chalk white, but she managed to stand on shaking legs. Brad looked up from his phone for the first time in an hour, his expression confused. "Now I know some people think your old man is too conservative with money," Harold said with a chuckle. "But sometimes you have to recognize opportunity when it comes knocking." Rachel's identified a commercial property in downtown Albany that represents exactly the kind of smart investment we should all be making. Uncle Martin leaned forward with interest. "Commercial real estate, that sounds promising." "It absolutely is," Harold continued enthusiastically. "The property is currently undervalued due to some temporary market conditions, but Rachel's analysis shows it could appreciate by 40 to 50% within the next 2 years. We're talking about potentially turning a $150,000 investment into over $200,000. The room buzzed with impressed murmurs. Cousin Jessica asked about the type of property. Aunt Carol wanted to know if Rachel was accepting other investors. Harold basked in the attention, clearly enjoying his role as the father of such a financially savvy daughter. Rachel stood frozen in the middle of it all, her face a mask of terror, as Harold described an investment opportunity that existed only in her desperate imagination. I could see her calculating frantically, probably trying to figure out how to back out of this situation without admitting the truth. "The beautiful thing about this deal," Harold went on, "is that it's a win-win situation. Susan and I get to participate in Rachel's success while helping our daughter expand her real estate portfolio. It's the kind of family investment that benefits everyone." "Harold," Susan said quietly, but he was too caught up in his enthusiasm to notice her distress. "I've already arranged the home equity line of credit," Harold announced proudly. "We'll be able to give Rachel the funds she needs by next Friday, and then we'll all watch our money grow together." That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. My parents were about to mortgage their home, to give money to a daughter who would lose it to foreclosure within weeks. The time for protecting family harmony had passed. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. "Dad, before you finalize that investment, there's something everyone needs to know about Rachel's real estate portfolio." The room fell completely silent. Harold's smile faded as he looked at me with confusion and growing irritation. "Peter, this isn't the time for whatever point you're trying to make," Harold said dismissively. "Actually, Dad, this is exactly the time," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Because what you're describing as a smart investment is actually a financial disaster waiting to happen." Rachel made a small sound that might have been a whimper. "Peter, please don't do this." But I was already reaching into my jacket pocket for the documents I'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Or maybe hoping the moment would never come. "The lakeside mansion that's been the symbol of Rachel's financial success," I said, pulling out the foreclosure notice I'd copied. "It's been in foreclosure proceedings for the past 6 months. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that room as every family member processed what I'd just said." Harold's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. "That's impossible. Rachel, tell him he's wrong." All eyes turned to Rachel, who was standing in the middle of the room like a deer caught in headlights. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. "Peter," Uncle Martin said carefully, "that's a very serious accusation. Are you sure about this?" I handed him the foreclosure documents. "These are copies of the official notices filed with the county clerk's office. The property is currently 4 months behind on mortgage payments with a total debt of over $37,000 in missed payments and fees." Martin examined the papers, his expression growing more serious as he read. "These documents appear to be legitimate," he said quietly. Harold snatched the papers from Martin's hands, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "This has to be some kind of mistake, a paperwork error or identity theft." Rachel explained this to them. Rachel's composure finally cracked completely. She sank back onto the couch, her hands covering her face, as her shoulders shook with silent sobs. "There's no mistake, Dad," I said gently. The foreclosure is real. The bank has already started the process to take the house. If Rachel can't come up with the full amount owed by January 15th, the property will be sold at auction. The room erupted in shocked whispers and questions. Brad looked like he'd been struck by lightning, either the world's best actor or genuinely surprised by this revelation. Aunt Carol demanded to know how this was possible. Cousin Jessica asked if there was anything that could be done to stop it. But Harold just stood there staring at the foreclosure documents with an expression of complete bewilderment. For the first time in my life, I saw my confident, decisive father look truly lost. "I don't understand," he said weakly. "Rachel, you've been telling us about your successful real estate investments for years. The renovation projects, the market analysis, the appreciation in property value. Was all of that a lie?" Rachel looked up from her hands, mascara streaming down her cheeks. "Daddy, I can explain. It's not what it looks like. We've just had some temporary setbacks, some unexpected expenses. The foreclosure notice is just a formality. We're working with the bank to restructure the loan." "Rachel," I said quietly, "that's not true, and you know it." She whirled around to face me, anger flashing through her tears. "How would you know? You've never owned property, never dealt with banks or mortgages. You're living in a rental apartment, making assumptions about things you don't understand." For a moment, the old family dynamic reasserted itself. Harold's expression shifted slightly, as if he wanted to believe Rachel's explanation and dismiss my interference. But I wasn't the insecure kid brother anymore, and I had evidence that couldn't be explained away. "You're right that I've never owned property," I replied calmly. "But I do understand financial documents. And I understand that when someone receives a foreclosure notice, it's not a formality or a temporary setback. It's a legal proceeding that ends with losing your home." I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos I'd taken of the bank statements. "These show the payment history for the past year. Rachel hasn't made a full mortgage payment since March. The property taxes are also delinquent, and there are multiple liens filed against the property for unpaid contractor bills." Harold took my phone with trembling hands, scrolling through the evidence with growing horror. Each document told the same story: financial collapse hidden behind a facade of success. "Rachel," Harold said in a voice I'd never heard from him before, small and broken, "is this true?" My sister looked around the room at all the faces staring at her, family members who had admired and envied her lifestyle, who had used her success as a benchmark for their own lives. There was nowhere left to hide. "Yes," she whispered, "it's true." The admission seemed to drain all the energy from her body. She slumped against the couch cushions like a marionette, with cut strings finally free from the exhausting effort of maintaining her lies, but devastated by the cost of that freedom. Harold sat down heavily in his armchair, the foreclosure documents scattered at his feet. The proud father who had been bragging about his daughter's financial acumen just minutes earlier looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of 5 minutes. "But how?" Susan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did this happen? The house, the lifestyle, the success stories. Where did all of that come from?" Rachel didn't answer, just continued crying into her hands. Brad was staring at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time, his phone forgotten in his lap. The silence stretched on until I realized that Rachel wasn't going to provide any more answers. She'd admitted to the foreclosure, but she wasn't ready to confess to the deeper deceptions that had funded their lifestyle. And I was the only person in the room who knew the whole truth. "There's more," I said quietly, and Rachel's head snapped up in terror. "Peter, please," she whispered, "don't do this to our family." But it was too late for that. The facade was already cracked, and continuing to hide the truth would only make things worse. "The money to pay for their lifestyle," I said, looking directly at Harold, "has been coming from somewhere you'd never imagine." Rachel's desperate plea for silence told me everything I needed to know about her state of mind. But I couldn't stop now. My family needed to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with, especially Harold, who was still sitting there looking lost and confused rather than angry. "Peter, whatever you think you know," Rachel said with a trembling voice, "you're making assumptions. You're taking pieces of information out of context and creating a story that isn't true." But her protests only convinced me more that the family needed to hear everything. Rachel was still trying to manage the narrative, still hoping to minimize the damage and find some way to explain away her crimes. "I'm not making assumptions, Rachel," I replied, pulling out the bank statements I'd copied from Dorothy's apartment. "I'm stating facts that are documented in black and white." Harold looked up at me with weary confusion. "What other facts, Peter? What else could there possibly be?" The weight of what I was about to reveal pressed down on me like a physical force. Once these words were spoken, there would be no taking them back, no pretending this was all a misunderstanding or a temporary financial setback. "The money to maintain their lifestyle," I said carefully, "has been coming from Grandma Dorothy's savings account." The silence that followed was different from before. If the foreclosure revelation had been shocking, this was devastating. I watched as every family member in the room processed the implications of what I just said. Uncle Martin was the first to find his voice. "Peter, are you saying what I think you're saying?" I held up Dorothy's bank statements, my hands surprisingly steady despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. "Over the past 8 months, $56,000 has been withdrawn from Grandma Dorothy's savings account in amounts that correspond exactly with Rachel and Brad's mortgage payment schedule." Aunt Carol gasped audibly. Cousin Jessica's hand flew to her mouth. Harold's face had gone completely white. "That's impossible," Harold said weakly. "Dorothy doesn't have access to that kind of money. Her Social Security and pension barely cover her living expenses." "You're right," I replied. "She doesn't have access to withdraw that money. But Rachel does." I pulled out the power of attorney document I'd found in Dorothy's apartment. Rachel convinced Grandma Dorothy to sign this last year. It gives her complete control over Dorothy's finances, supposedly to help manage her bills and investments. Harold took the document with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the legal language that had given his daughter the power to steal from his mother. "But this doesn't prove anything," Rachel said desperately. "I am helping Grandma with her finances. She asked me to help her because she gets confused about banking and online payments. Those withdrawals were legitimate expenses." "What legitimate expenses, Rachel?" I asked quietly. "Because I have receipts for all of Dorothy's actual expenses and they're covered by her monthly income with money left over." I pulled out the detailed financial analysis I'd prepared showing Dorothy's income versus her real expenses. Grandma Dorothy's assisted living facility costs $3,200 per month, including meals and medical care. Her medications cost about $200 monthly after insurance. Her other expenses, clothing, personal items, occasional outings, total less than $300 per month. Her total monthly expenses are under $3,700, while her income is over $4,200. Harold was following along with the numbers, his financial acumen kicking in despite his emotional state. "So she should be saving money every month, not spending down her savings." "Exactly," I confirmed. "Instead, her account balance has dropped from $87,000 to $31,000 in 8 months. And the withdrawals don't correspond to any of her legitimate expenses." I pulled out my phone and showed them the timeline I'd created. March 15th. Rachel withdraws $4,000 from Dorothy's account. March 16th. Rachel and Brad's mortgage payment is due. April 12th. Another $3,000 withdrawal. April 13th. Their property tax payment is due. The pattern was undeniable. Every major withdrawal from Dorothy's account was followed immediately by a payment toward Rachel and Brad's housing expenses. Or tell? But even if that's true, Brad spoke up for the first time, looking genuinely confused. Rachel told me her grandmother was giving us loans to help with some temporary financial difficulties. She said Dorothy wanted to help us while she was still alive instead of waiting to leave us money in her will. I felt a moment of sympathy for Brad, realizing that Rachel had been lying to him as well. But that sympathy disappeared when I remembered the restaurant and his girlfriend. That might have been believable if Dorothy knew she was making loans, I replied. But when I ask her about helping you financially, she has no idea what I'm talking about. The room erupted in horrified whispers. The idea of taking advantage of an elderly person with dementia struck everyone as particularly cruel. Harold found his voice again, and this time there was steel in it. Peter, are you absolutely certain about this? Are you saying that Rachel has been stealing from my mother? Before I could answer, Rachel jumped up from the couch. It's not stealing, she shouted, her composure completely shattered. It's my inheritance anyway. Grandma Dorothy has always said she wanted to help her grandchildren, and I was just accessing that help a little early. I was going to pay it all back once our financial situation improved. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Rachel had just confessed to stealing from our grandmother in front of the entire family. Harold's face went through a transformation I'd never seen before. The disappointment and confusion were replaced by a cold fury that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd started yelling. "You stole from your grandmother," he said in a voice so quiet everyone had to strain to hear it. "You took advantage of an elderly woman with dementia to fund your lifestyle." Daddy, you don't understand," Rachel pleaded, reaching toward him. I was desperate. The mortgage company was going to foreclose and I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I could just buy some time, I could figure out a way to fix everything. By stealing from a 92-year-old woman who trusted you, Susan said, speaking for the first time since the revelations began. Her voice was thick with disgust and disappointment. But I wasn't finished. There was one more piece of the puzzle that would complete the picture of just how thoroughly Rachel's life had fallen apart. "There's something else everyone needs to know," I said, and Rachel's face went from white to green. "Peter, please," she whispered. "Haven't you done enough damage?" "This isn't about damage, Rachel. This is about truth. And the truth is that Brad's been planning to leave you." Every head in the room turned toward Brad, who looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "What are you talking about?" Brad demanded, but his voice lacked conviction. "I saw you last Tuesday night at Morton's Steakhouse with Amanda," I said quietly. "And I know about the offshore accounts and the asset protection strategies you've been researching." Brad's face crumbled as he realized his secret was out. Rachel turned to stare at her husband with the expression of absolute betrayal. "You've been having an affair," she whispered. Brad's silence was answer enough. Rachel sank back onto the couch as the final pillar of her carefully constructed life collapsed around her. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," Harold said with deadly calm. Rachel stole over $50,000 from her grandmother to pay for a house she couldn't afford while her husband was having an affair and planning to abandon her to face the consequences alone. The summary was brutal but accurate. Rachel's sobs filled the silence. As the full scope of her situation became clear to everyone in the room, Uncle Martin cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Harold, I think maybe we should give you and your family some privacy to work through this." But Harold shook his head. "No, Martin. I want everyone to see this. I want everyone to understand what we've been celebrating and holding up as an example of success." He turned to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not pride exactly, but something close to it. "Peter, how long have you known about all of this?" "I've been investigating for about 3 weeks, I replied. "Ever since I accidentally overheard Rachel's real estate agent discussing the foreclosure." "And you said nothing until now?" I nodded. I was hoping Rachel would find a way to make things right without destroying the family. But when I heard about your plan to mortgage your home, to invest in her real estate deal, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Harold's expression shifted to something like gratitude. You were protecting us. I was trying to protect everyone, I said, including Rachel. But Rachel wasn't interested in protection anymore. She was staring at Brad with a mixture of heartbreak and rage that was painful to witness. How long? She asked him. How long have you been planning to leave me? Brad couldn't meet her eyes. Rachel, this isn't the time or place. This is exactly the time and place, she screamed. I've lost everything because I was trying to maintain the life we built together, and you've been planning to abandon me. The raw pain in her voice was devastating. Despite everything she'd done, watching Rachel realize that her husband had betrayed her while she was destroying herself to save their marriage was genuinely heartbreaking. But there was no going back now. The truth was out, and everyone would have to live with the consequences. Harold stood up slowly, looking every one of his 68 years. Rachel, you need to leave. Both of you. I can't have you in my house right now. Daddy, please, Rachel begged. Let me explain, let me make this right. You stole from your own grandmother, Harold said with finality. You lied to your family for months while we worried about you and praised your success. There's nothing to explain and no way to make this right tonight. As Rachel and Brad gathered their things in humiliated silence, I felt no satisfaction in being proven right. I just destroyed my sister's life and potentially my family's relationship with her forever. But I'd also saved my parents from financial ruin and protected Dorothy from further exploitation. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting that there were no winners, only people trying to minimize the damage. The hardest part was watching Harold's transformation from proud father to devastated parent in the span of one evening. The golden child he'd held up as an example of success for decades had been revealed as a criminal who'd stolen from his own mother. And I was the son who'd exposed her. The weeks following Thanksgiving passed in a blur of difficult conversations, legal consultations, and family meetings that felt more like crisis management sessions. The holiday that was supposed to celebrate gratitude and family unity had instead become the night our family's foundation cracked wide open, forcing all of us to examine who we really were when the facades were stripped away. I spent the Friday after Thanksgiving in Dorothy's apartment, helping her understand what had happened to her money and what needed to happen next. Watching her process, the betrayal was one of the hardest things I'd ever experienced. The confusion in her eyes when I explained that Rachel had been taking money without permission, the way her hands shook as she looked at bank statements she didn't remember authorizing, it reinforced just how vulnerable she'd been and how cruel Rachel's exploitation had been. But she's such a sweet girl, Dorothy kept saying, as if she couldn't reconcile the granddaughter she loved with the person who'd stolen from her. She always brought me flowers and asked about my health. Why would she take my money without asking? Sarah helped me contact Adult Protective Services and arrange for a forensic accountant to document the full scope of the theft. The investigation revealed that Rachel had taken even more than I'd initially discovered. Nearly $68,000 over 10 months, including cash advances on the credit card she'd opened in Dorothy's name. The legal consequences were swift and severe. Rachel was charged with elder abuse, identity theft, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The district attorney's office took cases like this seriously, especially when they involved systematic theft over an extended period. But perhaps more devastating than the legal ramifications was the complete collapse of Rachel's social and professional networks. News of her arrest spread quickly through her industry contacts and social circles. The marketing firm where she worked terminated her employment immediately. Friends who had envied her lifestyle suddenly remembered urgent reasons to avoid her calls. Brad filed for divorce 3 days after Thanksgiving, exactly as I'd predicted. His attorney moved quickly to freeze joint assets and established that Rachel's debts were her sole responsibility. The offshore accounts I'd suspected were indeed real, and Brad had managed to hide over $200,000 in assets that should have been community property. The lakeside mansion went into foreclosure as scheduled. Rachel's desperate attempts to negotiate with the bank came to nothing once her criminal charges became public. The property sold at auction for significantly less than what they owed, leaving Rachel responsible for the deficiency balance on top of her criminal restitution. Harold's reaction to all of this was perhaps the most dramatic change I witnessed. The proud, overbearing father who had spent decades comparing his children disappeared almost overnight, replaced by a man who seemed genuinely humbled by how completely he'd misjudged his daughter's character. I failed her. He told me during one of our weekly lunches, a tradition that began in December when Harold started asking for my advice about family finances. I was so focused on her achievements that I never taught her the difference between success and the appearance of success. Dad, Rachel's choices are her responsibility. I replied, though I was still processing my own complex feelings about the situation. You couldn't have known she was capable of stealing from Grandma. But I created the environment where she felt like she had to maintain that image at all costs. Harold continued with painful self-reflection. I made it clear that your worth in this family was measured by your financial success. No wonder she was terrified to admit when things went wrong. Those conversations with Harold were some of the most honest we'd ever had. For the first time in my adult life, my father was actually listening to my perspective and treating my opinions as valuable. It was the relationship I'd always wanted, but the cost of achieving it felt almost too high. Susan's transformation was equally dramatic, but more positive. The passive, enabling behavior that had characterized her response to Harold's decisions for decades gave way to a new assertiveness. She took charge of protecting Dorothy's remaining assets and established new safeguards to prevent future exploitation. I should have spoken up years ago. Susan told me while we worked together to reorganize Dorothy's financial affairs. I always knew Harold's favoritism was damaging, but I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I was wrong. Susan also insisted that Harold attend counseling sessions to address his gambling instincts and need to chase high-return investments. The home equity line of credit he'd arranged was canceled, and they developed a conservative financial plan focused on preserving their retirement security rather than growing wealth through risky ventures. The extended family's reaction was mixed but generally supportive once they understood the full situation. Uncle Martin and Aunt Carol were horrified by Rachel's crimes, but impressed by my decision to speak up despite the personal cost. Cousin Jessica started asking me for financial advice for her and her boyfriend. Even family friends who had barely acknowledged me in the past began treating me as someone worthy of respect. But the most meaningful change was in my relationship with Dorothy. Free from Rachel's manipulation and with proper financial protections in place, she began to flourish in ways I hadn't seen in years. Her confusion lessened when she wasn't being pressured to sign documents she didn't understand. Her anxiety decreased when she wasn't being told conflicting stories about her finances. "You saved me, Peter." She told me during one of my visits, her mental clarity sharp and focused. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't figure out what it was. "You gave me my peace of mind back." Rachel's plea agreement came together in February. In exchange for accepting responsibility and agreeing to make full restitution, she avoided jail time, but received 3 years of probation and 400 hours of community service. The restitution amount included not just the money she'd stolen, but interest and penalties that brought the total to over $75,000. Paying it back would have been impossible given her circumstances, but Harold surprised everyone by offering to cover the restitution in exchange for Rachel entering a comprehensive therapy program to address the underlying issues that had led to her crimes. "She's still my daughter," Harold explained when Susan and I questioned the wisdom of enabling Rachel further. But this is the last time I bail her out of anything. She needs to understand that actions have consequences, and she needs to rebuild her life honestly from this point forward. The therapy requirement turned out to be transformative for Rachel. Working with a counselor who specialized in addiction and compulsive behavior, she began to understand how her need for approval and fear of failure had driven her to increasingly desperate measures. I was so terrified of disappointing Dad that I convinced myself lying was better than admitting I was struggling. Rachel told me during our first conversation since Thanksgiving, a carefully supervised meeting that was part of her recovery process. I know that doesn't excuse what I did to Grandma Dorothy, but I need you to understand that I never intended to hurt her. These conversations with Rachel were some of the most difficult and emotionally complex experiences of my life. Part of me was still angry about the theft and the years of humiliation I'd endured while she was secretly failing. But another part of me felt genuine sympathy for the pressure she'd felt to maintain an impossible standard of perfection. I need to make amends, Rachel continued. Not just financially, but personally. I owe you an apology that goes back years. You were never the failure in our family, Peter. I was just too proud and too scared to admit that you had your life together while mine was falling apart. The process of rebuilding family relationships was slow and careful. Rachel had to earn back trust that had been completely destroyed, while I had to learn how to accept her efforts at redemption without forgetting the lessons of her betrayal. By the time we gathered for Christmas 11 months later, our family looked nothing like the dysfunctional system that had characterized my childhood. Harold's annual toasts focused on character and integrity, rather than financial achievements. Susan had found her voice and used it to guide family decisions with practical wisdom. Dorothy was protected and thriving in her assisted living community, and Rachel was slowly rebuilding her life with honesty and humility that seemed genuine. Working as a customer service representative while attending community college to learn bookkeeping, a deliberately modest career choice that represented her commitment to changing her relationship with money and success. I'm proud of all my children, Harold said during his Christmas toast, looking directly at me. Peter, you showed tremendous courage in protecting our family, even when it meant making incredibly difficult choices. You've taught me what real strength looks like. The transformation wasn't complete. Families don't heal overnight from decades of dysfunction. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I belonged at that dinner table, not as the disappointing younger son, but as a valued family member whose judgment and character were respected. My consulting business continued to thrive partly because the skills I'd developed in investigating Rachel's situation proved valuable in helping other businesses identify financial irregularities and fraud. The experience had taught me that the ability to see through facades and ask hard questions was a genuine professional asset, not just family drama management. Sarah and I got engaged in March, partly because the crisis had shown both of us how important it was to build relationships based on honesty and mutual respect rather than external appearances. She'd been instrumental in helping me navigate the legal and emotional complexities of Rachel's situation, and her professional expertise in elder care had ensured Dorothy received the protection she deserved. You did the right thing, Sarah told me the night before we announced our engagement to the family. It took tremendous courage to speak up, and you probably saved multiple people from financial and emotional devastation. It still feels like I destroyed my sister's life, I replied, wrestling with guilt that would probably never completely disappear. You exposed the truth about choices she had already made, Sarah corrected gently. The consequences came from her actions, not your decision to reveal them, and ultimately, that exposure gave her the chance to get help and rebuild honestly. Looking back now, I understand that Thanksgiving evening was the night I finally grew up and accepted responsibility for protecting the people I loved even when that protection required making enemies of people who had hurt them. It was the night I learned that real strength comes not from avoiding conflict, but from facing it with integrity when the stakes are high enough. The most important lesson I learned was that family loyalty doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior or staying silent when people you love are harming themselves and others. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is tell the truth that no one wants to hear, even when that truth costs you relationships you've spent a lifetime trying to preserve. My parents never had to mortgage their home or lose their retirement savings to Rachel's schemes. Dorothy's remaining money was protected and properly managed. Rachel faced consequences that forced her to confront her problems rather than escalating them further. And I finally earned the respect and appreciation I'd been seeking my entire life, not by changing who I was, but by having the courage to act according to my values when it mattered most. The family gatherings now are smaller and quieter, but they're also more honest and emotionally safer. We talk about real problems instead of maintaining false facades. We celebrate genuine achievements rather than impressive appearances. And when someone is struggling, we offer help instead of judgment or comparison. It took a crisis to get us there, but we finally became the family we'd always had the potential to be. And I learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people you love is the courage to tell them the truth, even when that truth is devastating. Because only from a foundation of honesty can you build relationships that are strong enough to survive anything. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and speaking a difficult truth that could protect someone you love? What did you choose and how did it turn out? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that real strength often means doing the right thing even when it's the hardest choice you've ever had to make. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more real-life stories about courage, family, and the complex choices we all face. And don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear about the power of speaking truth with love. Until next time, remember that your character is defined not by the challenges you avoid, but by how you respond when the people you care about need you to be brave.